Following this sudden swing in German public opinion related to the issue of migration in the aftermath of the Cologne events on New Year's night, Time magazine on February 1st this year used an iconic title image. Crowds of Pegida supporters, the Patriotic Europeans against the Islamization of Europe, are shown gathering in front of Dresden's scenic skyline. They are displaying German flags, particularly striking a flag similar to the Norwegian with a cross, and German colors designed during resistance against the Nazi regime. For the supporters of Pegida, the current government in Germany is portrayed as an evil dictatorship, plotting deception, destruction and war against its own people. Something they associate with the refugee and migration politics of the last 24 months. My paper today would try to give an answer to the question how a small circle of friends connecting via Facebook in autumn 2014 took to the streets of Dresden and other German cities, created a new political movement and thus contributed to a radical shift in how contemporary politics in Germany is framed. When the first reports about Pegida evening walks in Dresden reached Germany and German media in 2014, the assumption was that they gathered neo-Nazis and people structurally excluded from German society. But to the surprise of researchers and analysts, the xenophobic message struck a chord with a far more established segment of the German electorate, right in its middle class. The phenomenon is puzzling in many regards, where my main focus and concern is how pressing societal problems are framed, how the limits for what is possible to express shift to previously radical positions, and how language, concepts and symbols are re-semanticized, how they change their meaning and prepare the ground for radicalization of actions. My paper is structured around this following points. First, I will talk a little bit about material and my approaches. Secondly, I will give you a short chronology and background of Pegida. I will show and present findings of empirical social studies and some qualitative explanations. And then I will present you 3 inside views. One book that is about the Pegida movement, one field study I did with a conservative publisher who has sided with Pegida, and the third, some voices from what I call the Pegida galaxy to supporters of Pegida in West Germany. And finally, I will make some conclusions about language and radicalization. So starting with materials and approaches, I have used combined approach. I have been on a field study to Germany in November 2015. I have carried out a literature review of the freshest German research in the area. And as you can see, it's from last year and even this year. And I have also made a qualitative analysis of internal publications of Pegida supporters. First of all, there's a special issue of a journal called Secession, already that an ominous title, from March 2015. Secondly, a book from a Pegida supporter called Sebastian Hennig, Pegida Walks Across the Horizon, a chronicle. So I'm combining different approaches here. I'm conceptual history that is interested in changes of meaning in political concepts and words over time. Rainer Koselleck is maybe the most famous conceptual historian in that regard. And my hypothesis in studying language in relation to radicalization is that the altered usage of language and concepts in political vocabulary marks a diversion from agreed consensus and thus prepares the ground for radicalization. That is a hypothesis that we can discuss also in relationship to the other papers presented here today. But first, a little chronology and background. The Patriotic Europeans against the Islamization of the Occident were established in 2014. It's a Facebook initiative that was taking the protests to the streets, so going from online activism to offline activism, and so to speak, old-fashioned offline activism on the streets. Within weeks, the initiative grew to 25,000 participants in these so-called evening walks in Dresden. The movement split in February 2015 due to personal and ideological issues, which caused a decrease in participation. between 5 and 10,000 are still the nucleus of the movement. There was an attempt to tap into political counter-jihadism. They invited Geert Wilders from Holland in April 2015. In that period, also representatives of what we could brand the German Nouvelle Droite, so the new right, side with the movement. And we can measure and see a considerable move to the right in the opinions expressed by the remaining supporters. And a considerable radicalization of language during the refugee crisis during summer and autumn 2015. In November 2015, a website was launched called 1%.de, trying to recruit 1% of the German electorate and attempting to coordinate resistance, as they call it, against asylum politics in Germany. By February 2016, that website had 22,000 supporters, and that means people who have donated money, crowdsourcing, to fund this initiative. The entire Pegida movement received a new momentum in the aftermath of the Cologne New Year's events 2015 to 2016. And for those of you who might have missed out, that was when a considerable group of immigrants to Germany attacked and assaulted predominantly women outside the Cologne main train station. Well, in short, one could talk about that, but that is actually not part of my research, so I just mentioned it in passing. What are the findings of the empirical social studies that have been done so far? Well, the core of Pegidistas, as they are called by the researchers, by the Dresden Technical University, Vorländer and his team, belong to the middle class of Dresden and Saxony and its fragile segments. They are predominantly male, they are between 30 and 60 years old, employed or self-employed, with a relatively high level of education, and interesting enough, engineering and science degrees are most dominant there, and they have a relatively stable income. Most of them have no party and no religious affiliation. We are in Eastern Germany, where if you take it together with the Nazi period, during 70 years there is almost non-existent church affiliation. But there is a clear leaning towards the German protest party Alternative für Deutschland. They're giving the following reasons for protest to the social scientists. First, in falling order. So the first is a general sense of distance between politicians and people, a discontent with asylum politics, a discontent with media coverage, a discontent with the political system of the German Federal Republic, a discontent with migration and integration politics, and more surprisingly, as the last reason, reservations against Islam. If you consider the name of the movement, Patriotic Europeans against the Islamization of Europe, that is the most striking finding here. Vorländer and his team say this is a new type of social movement, a right-wing populist movement of indignation. So there's a combination of the indignation movements we have seen in for instance, in Greece or in Spain, evolving, and the right-wing content. When it comes to qualitative explanations, the following analysis by the written material that had been available until March 2015 is that you can see in the language that is used uneasiness. In the German, the title of the study is Auftrumpfendes Unbehagen. So something is, people feel uneasy and they want to pay back. In the language of Pegida, you'll find a rejection of complex structures as typical for modern society. There's a rejection of supranational political organization instead of traditional statehood. There's a rejection of globalization, a rejection of modern developments in society, such as intercultural individuality and self-responsibility. There is a sense of strengthening the own by excluding the foreign. There is law and order, warranted by a strong state, acting according to traditional patterns. But at the same time, and which we might find is inconsistent, incorporating larger rights of direct participation and direct democracy. Societal homogeneity and adherence to traditional social norms is promoted. And there's a demand for attention from this side of the ruling political class or the elites, but simultaneously, and again a bit inconsistent, a need to denounce the rulers out of incompetence, permanent failure, corruption, and what they call treason. I now turn to my own research in the area, based upon first-hand accounts in a book that was written giving account of the movement between November 2014 to 2015. The final quote of the book is, the salvation of the European spirit commences in Dresden. That is why I chose that heading. When you read that book, what struck me was considerable so-called nostalgia. What is that? Nostalgie, that's a German term, referring to that people living in Eastern Germany are longing for the old times of the GDR. Pegida is tapping into the momentum of the 1989 movements of the civil rights movement in the GDR that eventually contributed to the fall of the system. There is a critique against and a clear hate of Western Germany that is resurfacing in the Pegida movement. And you can find a pro-Russian stance, for instance, concerning the war in the Ukraine, or President Putin, and so on. That might be explained by this nostalgia too. There is something interesting, a blatant anti-Americanism that is displayed as well. And of course, most strikingly, there's a denigration of media as system media, which they call Systemmedien or media liars, Lügenpresse, constantly voiced. There's also a strong elite critique. The German people are exposed to conspiracy of its own government. They are talking about, on stage, about a war against the people. Immigration constitutes a mass rape of the European people, they say. And it is clearly an anti-EU movement. There's a critique against the bureaucracy. They're using the '89 slogan of "We are the people," and that is projected upon contemporary protests. Secondly, I visited a conservative publisher with the publishing house Antaios. His name is Götz Kubitschek. He has a past in the German military forces. And he has cited Pegida in spring 2015. Götz Kubitschek says there is a need to strengthen the bonds and coordinate different initiatives according to the agenda of the German New Right. He deliberately calls himself a representative of the German New Right. He voices the apocalyptic idea that the German political system first must be torn down completely in order to resurrect again. And then after that final battle, there will be a few Germans standing who know what Germany is all about, and with them it would be possible to reconstruct Germany as a new state. But the system of the German Federal Republic is doomed to fail and has to fail, and the New Right has to work to bring about the failure of that system. He's also, which is interesting if you know about the history of ideas of conservatism, advocating resistance as a legitimate conservative position. So in his mind, it is a duty of every conservative German to make resistance against the system. He is the architect behind the platform inrelation.De, with the aim to create a momentum for the German Nouvelle Droite. What you see here is the title page of this special issue, Secession, that is about Pegida, and a book where the leading circle of the German New Right is meeting at his chivalric estate somewhere on the countryside. And the small picture over here that you barely can see shows Kubitschek in his garden chasing a goat, because he has also chosen as a strategy of resistance to move to the countryside and become self-sustainable. You will also see that flag in a moment, a bit more in a larger fashion, that I already showed on the Time magazine cover. That is a flag that was used by the German conservative resistance against the Nazi regime, and the Nouvelle Droite in Germany is reclaiming that symbolism for their own sake. This is the page of the website 1% für unser Land. As you can see here, it is about the migration to Germany. Who is pulling the brakes? Angela Merkel. She will not, but you will, I and you, we will do. 1% of the Germans, we don't need more. And then it goes on and on and on. You can visit the website and see what kind of material they are posting. They are filming people who are building human walls against migration at the border to the Czech Republic, for instance, and who are organizing resistance on a local basis around Germany. Most researchers believe that Pegida is an Eastern German phenomenon. I connected with two supporters of Pegida living in the West and who also are both born in two Western states of Germany. A policeman and Maria, a teacher student. There's a huge consonance when talking to them about what one might call typical Pegida positions. The first one, there is a particular language regime within which things are allowed to be said and others not, respectively where the authorities have imposed paraphrases, euphemisms or mere silence. They were constantly recurring to the term Sprechverbot, so an explicit prohibition to talk about something about it. Were also talking about the Lügenpresse, so the media liars. They were going on for quite a while about the complex of guilt that has been hammered into the Germans since 1945, which is detrimental for German pride, and therefore the Nouvelle Droite is absolutely right in kind of building on the resurrection. And they also say it's important to differentiate between various groups of immigrants. I cannot develop that further, but yeah, that's an interesting point we can maybe come back to in the discussion. There's a fundamental rift between rulers and rule in Germany, and closely linked to this in their own perception is that it is up to the people at the bottom of the hierarchy to clean up the policies imposed by the powerful. So it's up to the teachers and policemen, so to speak, which they self are, to deal directly with the mess. But no one has instructed them to do it and how to do it. What I take a photo of was a traditional newspaper outlet called Junge Freiheit that basically is voicing the positions that circulate in the Pegida galaxy and the protest party Alternative für Deutschland, which I have not researched and therefore cannot say so much about. But there are overlaps between the protest party and the Pegida movement that need to be explored further. In my preliminary conclusions about language and radicalization, we can see that there's a circulation of political terminology from yet undefined sources. We don't know how certain terms and ideas come to the banners, chants and mottos of the Pegida movement, although we can be pretty sure where they come from. More research is needed. For instance, to explore the connections between publishers like Antaios, which is Götz Kubitschek, and other idea instances to the movement, the German Nouvelle Droite and its European connections, and most certainly the impact of social media needs to be, or social network sites needs to be researched more closely, because I assume that some of the ideas are formed in that galaxy. And as in the case as moving from Facebook to the streets, also the concepts and ideas are moving from social network sites to the streets. There's a clear recycling of tropes from the '89 citizen movement for a new purpose in a new context that also strikes a chord with people definitely in the east of Germany and to a less extent also in the west. And there is a clear redefinition or reappropriation of symbols, like, for instance, this German resistance flag, the Wehrmacht flag, as one of the main trope. The tone of confrontation and demagogic denunciation against media and elites increases clearly between November 2014 and September 2015 and has received a new momentum, as I said before, after the Cologne events. The expansion of linguistic limits of how problems are framed and which solutions are proposed. For instance, the Alternative für Deutschland in February this year proposed the use of gunfire against unarmed migrants at borders, shows a move from cultural to direct violence. We see that extreme solutions are normalized, particularly after Cologne. Media and politicians express formally rejected positions openly in the press, and a society discourse moves from a previously agreed compromise to formally radical positions. all this to me demonstrate that radicalization is a dynamic movement, and by studying the language that circulates in radical movements, we can actually see the dynamic movements from mainstream to radical and mainstreaming of radical, which I think are two movements that some of the papers already have addressed. Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you very much. Now please, Vitt, you're free to comment upon Andreas' paper.
Okay. Hi again. Thanks for thought-provoking paper. I would like really briefly summarize 3 points I found most intriguing, not only in your presentation, but also in the paper I've read. And these 3 points actually sort of serve as a starting platform for my questions. First, you show that there are, and more in the paper in your presentation, that there are inherent inconsistencies in both Pegida's ideological statements and public proclamations, yet these inconsistencies seem not to interfere with the movement's ability to mobilize its supporters and set political agenda. The second point is that you say that despite the Pegida's proclamative key issues it's like anti-Islamization and anti-immigration agenda, what seems to concern its supporters more is some dissatisfaction or deep dissatisfaction with the political elites, so-called system media, and generally the way in which political issues are solved and discussed in contemporary German society. And third point, which I found really intriguing, is your concept of the normalization of extreme solutions that you show in the end of your paper, how the recent measures and even propositions taken by German politicians and media recognition of typical Pegida positions mark somehow change or societal consensus to what formerly was perceived as being on the margins. And from these 3 points, I would like to pose my, again, 3 questions, and really briefly. First, really interesting is the concept of Lügenpresse, or the system media, the liars media. Are there some interplays between Pegida audiences and some media outlets? You know, like what media they do consume, or they read or consider, you know, not system media or not Lügenpresse, or do they create their own media outlets? And what is the role of social media in this kind of media circulation? Second is what is the strategy Pegida uses to reconcile the inherent inconsistencies you are talking about? You know, what is the overarching sort of like strategy, how they deal with these different streams and inconsistencies they are formed of? And finally, what I found interesting is like in your paper on many occasions, you are talking about the sort of like, quote, "we are under attack" mentality. And I would like to know more, what roles does it play as a possibly cohesive element of what is in other ways highly heterogeneous movement, or if it actually does play a role like that? Thanks.
Thank you so much. Well, the first one about the Lügenpresse is interesting because traditional print media, for instance, in Dresden, was actually punished by people who had subscriptions after November 2014. So traditional print media, people did not subscribe anymore in the same amount, and they were rejecting to read their own traditional media. I don't want to use mainstream media. That is one interesting thing. The second thing is that, of course, as I showed in the case of Junge Freiheit, that is a press outlet of the traditional way that in former times really was living at the margin of the right-wing German press spectrum, but that now sort of has been respectable because they are the only true voice perceived by the people in the Pegida galaxy. And I would say, by reading it, I would say it's kind of intelligent journalism. So I understand why people think it's a good paper. So it's not the kind of membership newspaper of the National Party of Germany, which is the traditional, really right-wing party that is almost prohibited in Germany. And then the question about own media, and that brings back to the discussion about mainstream media before. Yes, these people seem to fall into these echo chambers where they are creating their own media outlets on their own, somehow, that are replacing traditional media as sources of information. And inrelation.De is exactly, they are copying the style of traditional media. They are sending out TV teams who are reporting from these public resistance things. They're interviewing people, they're publishing articles. But that is the kind of media that people in the Pegida galaxy will use. So I think it is strengthening the turn back from the traditional printed press, and it is also strengthening the position of user-created media, so to speak. Definitely. The strategy to address the apparent inconsistencies, that's an interesting thing, because normally we would love to find one ideological document that tells us what is Pegida about, or the Bible of Pegida, or our struggle, or something like that, yes? But you don't, and there are rather inconsistent demands. Some of the inconsistency is what they actually want to have, because they don't want to get nailed down as a clear right-wing voice. They want to be able to attract people who have learned during the GDR that fascism is a bad thing. So those people they still want to attract, so they would never say anything. And as you saw on their symbols, they are throwing the swastika into the bin. Yeah? And by that you can attract segments of the East German population that have been grown up in the spirit of anti-fascism, but that now are going behind other positions. So this is a little bit related to the concept of leaderlessness, because, and I use the term word cloud in my paper, where certain concepts are surfacing but no clear position is made, which they successfully are using. Another example is pro-Israel or against Israel. At the demonstrations, there are people showing the Israeli flag, and 2 meters beside them somebody who is burning an Israeli flag. And they are yet marching together against the elites. Well, that's an interesting thing, that they are managing to build bridge between these apparently irreconcilable positions. Another thing, in one of the Pegida position papers, there was pro-homosexuality was stressed, and that is a kind of appropriation, because if you're pro-gay, then you're also anti-Muslim. So it's a kind of intelligent propaganda move to appropriate pro-gay stances in the civilizational fight. The last question about the "we are under attack" rhetoric, yes, that is absolutely so. And that is something that has been growing. That was not as strong in the beginning. But since summer 2015, Pegida representatives have repeatedly made the comment that they are in war against the federal government of Germany. And why Kubitschek and his consorts are talking about resistance as the legitimate strategy. Yeah?
I think there is room for maybe one brief question or comment. Please.
I'll try to be as brief as I can. Just one comment. I think your view on Werner Petzeltz, it needs a bit more nuance. That would be my suggestion. Right. Knowing him, I think that he is much more analytical and neutral in his view of Pegida than perhaps you give credit for. Yeah. That being said, I think that at the end of your paper, the statement that this conceptual fuzziness is something you disagree with is of profound import, and I would suggest that's for 2 reasons. One, the new right it seems to me absolutely driving this project in terms of trying to justify many of their ideas, what they call, winning the war of ideas and cultural hegemony. So the first part of my question is, the problem with the new right is it never really was populist, going back to '68. So how the populism of Pegida would connect to the new right seems to me profoundly important. Secondly, of course, at this weekend, we saw Pegida not only in Dresden, but in Australia, in the UK, and many countries in between. So that raises the other question of what you say here, how far, let's say, the rejection of conceptual fuzziness and some ideology applies to other contexts and other countries, now that we're talking about a transnational movement.
Absolutely. We could add Sweden to that, because Pegida Malmö, for instance, gathered 8 people and like 3,000 counter demonstrators. But now the switch has been for 2 weeks ago or something, there was a demonstration in Stockholm that was called Liberty Movement or something that already attracted 350. Yeah, so it's kind of rephrased, and then you get more traction, which is an interesting phenomenon and ties into the idea with the conceptual fuzziness, because then you get more. You can create a larger community of support by being fuzzy, which allows people on the margins to do and think and say things under the roof of a kind of fuzziness or tolerance. That is my interpretation of why they want to have conceptual fuzziness. And I think it ties into the concept of leaderless resistance, because if you have one ideologue and that person is going to be a nut, like Lutz Bachmann was shown as with Hitler outfit, then the movement can be destroyed. But if you are fuzzy and you allow this fuzziness, then you don't need a leader and you don't need a manifesto. You can unite different positions. And the international development is, of course, highly interesting. I think it's very recent. It's not successful. And I think we see one tendency that Pegida in outside Germany actually is tying up with the real right-wing radicals, which is a difference to Germany. Yes, precisely. The hooligan skinhead scene, rather.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Andreas, and thank you, Vitt, for your discussion.